At first glance, the third epistle of John might seem like just a short personal letter, almost insignificant compared to other grand theological writings in the Bible. In its original Greek, it contains only 219 words, making it the shortest book in the New Testament. However, hidden within its brevity is a depth of wisdom that continues to speak powerfully to believers today. Far from being a casual note, this letter is a personal yet profound message from the Apostle John, one of the last living eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ. By the time he wrote this letter, John was an elderly man who had walked closely with Christ, witnessed his miracles, heard his teachings firsthand, and seen both the birth and struggles of the early church. He wasn't just any church leader. He was someone who had stood at the very heart of the Christian story. Instead of writing a lengthy theological essay or addressing an entire congregation as he did in his other letters, John chose to write to a single individual, a believer named Gaius. This immediately sets the tone of the letter as something intimate and relational. Yet, within this simple structure lies a crucial purpose. John wasn't just checking in on a friend. He was dealing with a growing crisis in the early church, one that continues to be relevant today: the conflict between truth and power, between faithful leadership and corrupt ambition. The early Christian communities were under enormous pressure during this time. Externally, they faced persecution from the Roman Empire and rejection from Jewish religious authorities who viewed followers of Christ as a dangerous sect. But even more dangerous than the external threats were the internal struggles the church faced. Division, false teaching, and power-hungry leaders were tearing churches apart from the inside. What was meant to be a spiritual family united by truth and love was, in many places, fragmenting under the weight of pride, selfish ambition, and fear. John, who was likely living in the city of Ephesus at the time, a city full of cultural richness but also spiritual corruption, had personally witnessed the damage these forces could cause. He had seen leaders rise up who cared more about their own influence than about shepherding God's people. One such man was Diotrephes, a church leader who rejected the authority of the apostles, refused hospitality to missionaries, and even cast faithful believers out of the church simply because they tried to do what was right. His actions were fueled by a desire to be first, to control rather than to serve. In contrast to Diotrephes, John points to Gaius, who is portrayed as a faithful and generous man. Despite the tensions and risks, Gaius consistently opened his home and heart to traveling missionaries and gospel workers. In the ancient world, hospitality wasn't just a nice gesture. It was a vital ministry. There were no hotels or organized missionary networks. Evangelists depended entirely on the kindness of fellow believers. To welcome them was not just an act of kindness, but a bold declaration of loyalty to Christ and his mission. Gaius's example shows us that even in the face of opposition, it is possible to stand firm, serve others, and remain true to the gospel. Through this short letter, John addresses not only the situation of Gaius, Diotrephes, and the local church, but also leaves a timeless message for all believers. The third epistle of John reminds us that walking in truth is not simply about holding correct beliefs. It is about living them out in our relationships, our leadership, and especially in how we treat those who labor for the gospel. John's words challenge every generation to guard the church against division, corruption, and the love of power, and instead to live faithfully, love generously, and lead humbly. At the heart of 3 John, we meet 3 key figures whose lives and choices reflect 3 very different paths a believer can take: Gaius, Diotrephes, and Demetrius. Through them, John shows us what it looks like to walk in truth, to abuse power, and to live with quiet integrity. Each of these men leaves behind a legacy, and John's letter forces us to consider which of these legacies we are building in our own lives. The first character is Gaius. the main recipient of the letter and the man John holds up as an example of faithfulness. Gaius wasn't just someone who claimed to believe the gospel. He lived it out in a way that was seen and felt by everyone around him. His commitment to the truth wasn't just theoretical or something he professed on special occasions. It was woven into his everyday actions. What stood out most about Gaius was his hospitality. At that time, traveling preachers and missionaries had no formal support systems. There were no hotels willing to house Christians, no organized missions boards sending resources. Evangelists depended entirely on the generosity of local believers. Gaius became one of those believers who opened his home to strangers simply because they were fellow servants of Christ. John is deeply moved by this. He says, "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth." Gaius's faithfulness didn't just encourage the traveling workers, it refreshed and strengthened the entire church. In a culture where fear and self-preservation were common, Gaius's generosity was a bold act of allegiance to Christ and his kingdom. In sharp contrast to Gaius stands Diotrephes, a leader who embodies the dangers of pride and power gone unchecked. Unlike Gaius, Diotrephes wasn't concerned about walking in the truth, he was concerned about being in control. John describes him as someone who loves to be first, a devastating indictment coming from one of the last living apostles. Diotrephes refused to welcome John and his fellow workers, rejected the authority of the apostles, and even went as far as excommunicating believers who dared to show hospitality to God's servants. His leadership wasn't marked by humility, service, or love, but by self-interest, manipulation, and division. What makes Diotrephes' story even more tragic is that he wasn't an outsider or a false teacher preaching heresy. He was an insider, someone who had been entrusted with leadership, yet used that position to hurt, control, and isolate others. John's warning is clear. Corruption doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it comes from within, through leaders who put their own ambitions ahead of the well-being of God's people. Then there is Demetrius, a figure who, although only briefly mentioned, leaves a lasting impression. John simply says that Demetrius is well spoken of by everyone and even by the truth itself. That short commendation speaks volumes. Unlike Diotrephes, who worked to defend and elevate himself, Demetrius didn't have to promote his own reputation. His life did it for him. His character and integrity were so consistent, so genuine, that even the truth, the very message of God, testified on his behalf. Demetrius represents the power of a quiet, faithful life. He shows us that we don't need to strive for recognition or authority to make an impact. True influence comes from integrity, living day after day in a way that honors God, serves others, and reflects Christ. John's choice to mention these three men wasn't random. He was giving the church and us three living examples of how different people respond to the gospel. Gaius shows us what it looks like to walk in truth with generosity and courage. Diotrephes warns us of the dangers of selfish ambition and corrupt leadership. Demetrius inspires us to live with integrity so strong that even the truth itself will bear witness to our character. In every generation, including ours, these three paths are still laid before us. Whether we lead, serve, or simply live out our faith in daily life, we are all leaving behind a legacy. The question is, will it be one of faithfulness, like Gaius, one of corruption, like Diotrephes, or one of unwavering integrity, like Demetrius? At the very center of John's letter is a theme that is simple to say but challenging to live: walking in truth. This short phrase carries the weight of the entire message of 3 John. For the apostle, faith was never just about having the right beliefs or agreeing to the right statements. It was about living those truths out loud in daily life. in relationships, and especially in how we treat others, including strangers, brothers, and even enemies. For John, walking in truth was not optional. It was the very evidence of genuine faith. John opens his letter rejoicing that Gaius is walking in truth, and he even says, "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." Notice how personal this is for John. He's not talking about abstract doctrine or intellectual agreement. He's describing a way of life. Walking in truth is when a believer doesn't just know the right things, but actually lives them, even when it costs them something. This is exactly what made Gaius so remarkable. He didn't simply say he loved God. He showed it by welcoming, helping, and supporting others, even when it put him at odds with power-hungry leaders like Diotrephes. John reminds us that walking in truth is not always easy, especially when there is opposition. In fact, John writes this letter precisely because truth in Gaius's situation was under attack, not from Rome, not from outside persecution, but from within the church. Diotrephes was not a Roman governor or a pagan priest. He was a leader within the Christian community who used his position to control, divide, and even expel those who disagreed with him. John makes it painfully clear that the greatest threat to the church isn't always persecution from the outside. Sometimes it is selfish ambition and pride within. That's why walking in truth requires more than just head knowledge. It demands courage, integrity, and sacrifice. It means standing for what is right, even when influential people oppose you. Gaius showed this by extending hospitality to traveling missionaries even when it made him a target. His life was a living testimony to the truth. Demetrius, too, is said to be well spoken of by everyone, and even by the truth itself. This is a rare statement. It means that Demetrius lived in such a way that even the message of God could testify on his behalf. His reputation wasn't based on clever words or high positions, but on a consistent life of integrity. So what does it mean for us today to walk in truth? John shows us it's more than avoiding false teaching. It's about how we treat people. Do we use our influence, resources, and positions to serve or to control? Do we extend kindness and hospitality, especially to those who labor for the gospel? Are we more concerned about protecting our status or about building up the body of Christ? In every generation, Christians face the same decision. The church today, just like in the first century, struggles with internal division, power struggles, pride, and misplaced priorities. John's words cut through all the noise and ask a simple but difficult question. Are you walking in truth? Not just believing it, but actually living it. Walking in truth also means choosing unity over division. John finishes the letter with a tender reminder about Christian fellowship, calling believers not just to know one another, but to greet one another by name, to be deeply connected. Walking in truth is never a solitary path. It is meant to be walked together in community. Yet community is fragile if not built on humility, service, and love. Diotrephes serves as a warning of what happens when leadership is driven by pride instead of servanthood. It tears the church apart. On the other hand, Gaius and Demetrius show us that when believers commit to truth and love, they become living examples of Christ to the world. In the end, walking in truth is not about perfection, but about a consistent commitment to live in a way that reflects God's character. John's short letter invites us to examine our own hearts. Are we building people up or tearing them down? Are we serving for the glory of God or seeking recognition for ourselves? The challenge is as real for us today as it was for Gaius nearly 2,000 years ago. Will we walk in truth? As John's short but powerful letter unfolds, it becomes clear that this is more than just a personal encouragement to Gaius. It is a warning not only to the early church, but to every generation of believers. The situation that Gaius, Diotrephes, and Demetrius faced wasn't unique to their time. The struggles of pride, power, division, and corrupted leadership continue to affect the church today. John is reminding us that the real threat to the health of the church does not always come from outside forces like persecution or cultural opposition. Sometimes it comes from within. This is where the warning hits home. Diotrephes is a cautionary tale, not because he openly denied the faith or taught obvious heresy, but because he allowed pride and ambition to take root in his leadership. He loved to be first. He used his influence not to build up the body of Christ, but to protect his own status. Worse still, he actively opposed those who were doing the work of God. He shut out faithful believers, refused to welcome gospel workers, and even expelled those who showed them hospitality. John isn't just criticizing bad leadership, he is exposing the spiritual danger of using God's church as a platform for personal power. John's letter forces us to ask, how often do we see the spirit of Diotrephes today? Sadly, we still find leaders who value control more than service, who isolate themselves from accountability, and who care more about influence than about truth. And if we're honest, the temptation to act like Diotrephes isn't just reserved for leaders. Any one of us can, in small ways, fall into the same trap. Whenever we place our comfort, pride, or preferences above the good of the church, we echo the very spirit that John warns against. But the letter doesn't leave us stuck in fear or despair. Alongside this warning, John offers a clear application. First, he calls us back to the basics: walk in truth. Not just believe it, live it. Gaius and Demetrius both did this in different ways. Gaius showed it by welcoming strangers and faithfully supporting gospel workers. Demetrius, without even needing many words, lived such a life of integrity that even the truth itself testified about him. John is telling us that faithful, truthful living is always possible, even when the environment is difficult, even when leaders like Diotrephes create division. Secondly, John calls the church to courage. Faithfulness to God may cost you something. Gaius risked his standing in the church by welcoming those whom Diotrephes had rejected. Today, standing for truth may mean going against the grain, refusing to participate in gossip, confronting sin when necessary, or even losing influence for the sake of Christ. Yet, as John shows us, those who walk in truth are never alone. They carry the approval of God Himself, and their legacy will outlast any temporary opposition. Thirdly, John gives us a practical picture of what Christian community should look like. His closing words, reading believers by name and expressing hope to meet face to face, are not just friendly farewells. They are reminders that the church is meant to be a real, connected, loving community. True Christian fellowship is not just about attending services or following religious routines. It's about building authentic relationships where people are known, loved, and challenged to grow together. John's letter presses us to make choices. Will we be like Diotrephes, subtly or openly seeking our own way? Will we be like Gaius, faithfully walking in truth even when it's costly? Or like Demetrius, living with such consistency and integrity that our lives speak louder than our words? Every day, in big and small ways, we are shaping our legacy. The third epistle of John reminds us that truth and love must never be separated. Faithfulness to God means standing firm for truth while opening our hearts wide in love and service. The church is healthiest when its members are marked not by ambition, pride, or fear, but by humble devotion to Christ and each other. So, today, John's question comes directly to us. How will you walk in truth? As John brings his letter to a close, he leaves us not just with instructions, but with a personal challenge, a call to look inward and reflect on the legacy we are building. The third epistle of John is more than a historical record of church conflict. It is a mirror held up to every believer, from the first century to today, forcing us to ask, what kind of follower of Christ am I becoming? John does not end his letter by simply praising Gaius or rebuking Diotrephes. Instead, he invites all believers to examine their own hearts and actions. The question isn't just whether Diotrephes existed back then. The real question is whether the spirit of Diotrephes has quietly crept into us, into our attitudes, into the way we treat others. Are we willing to sacrifice our preferences and status to serve the church and care for others? Or have we allowed pride, ambition, or fear to shape how we relate to the people around us? The challenge also extends to how we define leadership and influence. In today's world, we often equate leadership with visibility, charisma, and authority. But John reminds us through Gaius and Demetrius that true spiritual influence is measured not by power, but by integrity, generosity, and love. The most impactful believers are often those whose names are not on the stage, but whose lives are deeply rooted in walking in truth. They are the ones who quietly open their homes, faithfully encourage others, support the gospel, and stand firm when it costs them something. They are the ones whose reputations don't have to be defended because even the truth itself speaks on their behalf. John's final words are simple but profound. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. 3 John 1:14. In this short phrase, we see John's deep longing for real fellowship. The Christian life was never meant to be lived at a distance. Not in John's day, and not today. The church is not a collection of people who merely agree on the same doctrines, but a family that is called to love, serve, and grow together in truth. Face-to-face relationships are where the gospel is most beautifully lived out. In a world increasingly driven by screens and shallow connections, John calls us back to something far deeper, genuine relationships built on truth and love. And this message could not be more relevant today. Think about how often churches and Christian communities struggle with the very things John describes. Pride, power struggles, gossip, division, and a loss of real hospitality are just as common now as they were back then. Many believers today feel disconnected, skeptical, or even hurt by churches that have lost sight of the gospel's heart. John's letter, though short, offers a roadmap back to humble leadership, faithful service, and authentic community. Consider a modern example. You may have seen churches or ministries where someone like Diotrephes rises, a leader more concerned with control than with Christ. Maybe you've witnessed the damage it causes, division, fear, and the silencing of those who simply want to do good. But perhaps you have also met someone like Gaius or Demetrius. Maybe it was a humble, older woman who quietly prays for everyone in the church, or a young family who opens their home to missionaries, or a quiet leader who refuses to retaliate when wronged, but keeps serving faithfully. These are the people who change lives. These are the people who walk in truth. John's message is simple but powerful. Walking in truth will cost you, but it is worth it. The legacy you leave behind in your family, in your church, and in your community is not measured by how much recognition you receive, but by how faithfully you loved, served, and stood for the truth. Whether you are in a position of leadership or simply living out your faith day by day, your life tells a story. So now the question comes to you. When your story is told, what will be said of you? Will you be remembered as someone who walked in truth, loved deeply, served faithfully, and left behind a legacy that pointed people to Christ? or will pride and self-interest define your influence? The choice is yours, and you make it one step at a time.